February 5, 1978. Boston woke to a gray Monday morning. Commuters filled the subways, office workers grabbed coffee, school kids bundled up for another winter day. Nobody knew that within 24 hours the entire Northeast would become a frozen war zone. The weather forecasts had mentioned snow. They always did in February. But the predictions were vague, contradictory, almost dismissive. Some stations called for 6 inches. Others said maybe a foot. A few meteorologists noticed something unusual in the data, but the technology of 1978 simply couldn't piece together what was really coming. Whether satellites existed, yes, but they were primitive. The GOES-1 satellite had launched just 2 years earlier. Doppler radar was still experimental. Computer models ran on machines with less power than a modern calculator. Meteorologists relied on surface observations, radiosonde balloons, and educated guesses. They could see individual storm systems, but predicting how they would interact was nearly impossible. And this storm was anything but simple. 2 separate low-pressure systems were moving across North America. One tracked from the Midwest, pulling Arctic air southward. The other formed off the Carolina coast, drawing moisture from the Atlantic. Alone, each would produce a typical winter storm. Together, they would create something catastrophic. The phenomenon is called explosive cyclogenesis. Meteorologists today call it a bomb cyclone. In 1978, they barely understood it existed. On the evening of February 5th, some forecasters began revising their predictions upward. 12 inches, maybe 18. But even these numbers failed to capture the real danger, because this wasn't just about snow totals. It was about timing, wind, and the storm track itself. The storm would hit during Monday's evening commute. It would intensify directly over New England. And it would stall, spinning in place like a hurricane for nearly 2 full days. Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis received the updated forecasts late that afternoon. His advisors debated whether to declare a state of emergency. Some argued for immediate action. Others worried about overreacting, shutting down the economy over a snowstorm. By the time they decided, it was already too late. Across New England, people made the calculations they always did. Check the forecast. Look at the sky. Decide whether to risk the commute or call in sick. Most chose to go to work. Schools remained open. Businesses operated normally. The Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority ran its full schedule. The region's infrastructure had been built for New England winters. Snowplows stood ready. Salt trucks were loaded. Emergency services were staffed, but all of these preparations assumed a predictable storm, the kind that came and went, leaving a day of cleanup in its wake. Nobody was prepared for what actually arrived. At 10 a.m. on February 6th, the first snowflakes began falling on Boston. Light, almost gentle, the kind of snow that makes the city look like a postcard. Traffic moved normally. People went about their business. Some even welcomed it, a proper winter storm to break the monotony of February. By noon, the snow was falling harder. Forecasts were being revised again. 2 feet, possibly more. Government offices began sending workers home early. But tens of thousands were already at work, scattered across the region, too far from home to simply walk back. The wind picked up around 1 p.m. Not gradually, but in sudden, violent gusts. 30 miles per hour, 40. 50. The snow stopped falling down and started flying horizontally. Visibility dropped to 0 in minutes, and then the roads began to disappear. Route 128 circled Boston like a concrete river. On a normal Monday afternoon, it carried over 200,000 vehicles. On February 6, 1978, it became a trap. The evening commute started early. By 2 p.m., thousands of cars were already on the highway, drivers hoping to beat the storm home. But the storm was accelerating faster than the forecasts predicted. The 2 low-pressure systems had merged off the coast, and the combined system was undergoing explosive intensification. Barometric pressure was dropping at a rate rarely seen outside of hurricanes. At 3:15 p.m., the Massachusetts State Police received the first reports of cars sliding off Route 128. Within 20 minutes, multiple accidents blocked all lanes in both directions. Drivers sat in their cars, engines running, waiting for the traffic to clear. The snow was already several inches deep on the roadway. By 4 p.m., nothing was moving. The temperature hovered around 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind speeds hit 60 miles per hour with gusts approaching 80. That created a wind chill of -20. The snow fell at a rate of 3 to 4 inches per hour. Not flurries, not a typical snowfall. A white curtain of ice crystals moving horizontally through the air at highway speed. Cars disappeared under snow in less than an hour. People tried to keep their engines running for heat, but exhaust pipes were quickly buried. Carbon monoxide poisoning became an immediate threat. Some drivers attempted to walk to safety, but visibility was measured in feet, not yards. Leaving your car meant risking death by exposure. Staying meant gambling that rescue would arrive before you ran out of gas. On Interstate 95 near the New Hampshire border, a woman went into labor in her stranded car. She was 3 weeks from her due date. Her husband tried to flag down help, but there was no one to flag. Every car around them was buried. He delivered the baby himself, cutting the umbilical cord with a shoelace, wrapping the newborn in everything they had. They survived, but only barely. Route 3 to Cape Cod became impassable by 5 p.m. The Southeast Expressway through Boston stopped moving entirely. Drivers abandoned cars and tried to walk, only to realize they couldn't see the road beneath their feet. Some took shelter under highway overpasses, huddling together with strangers for warmth. Inside Boston itself, the scene was surreal. The MBTA trains were still running, packed beyond capacity with people desperate to get home. But the above-ground sections of the orange and red lines were being buried by snow. At 6:30 p.m., a red line train stalled between stations. Passengers waited in the dark for 2 hours before being evacuated through emergency exits, then trudging through waist-deep snow to find shelter. Logan Airport closed at 4 p.m., but dozens of flights were already stranded on the tarmac. Passengers sat in planes for hours, watching through frosted windows as the airport disappeared under white. Some flights had arrived from sunny destinations just hours earlier. People in shorts and t-shirts were trapped in a blizzard. The snow wasn't light and fluffy. It was heavy, wet, dense. Each inch weighed pounds per square foot. Roofs began creaking under the load. Trees, still holding some leaves from a late fall, caught the snow like sails and snapped under the weight. Power lines sagged, then broke. By 7 p.m., over 10,000 people had lost electricity. By midnight, that number would be 500,000. Wind speeds peaked at 92 miles per hour at Plum Island, hurricane force. The sound was unlike anything people had experienced in a winter storm, not howling but roaring. A constant, mechanical scream that made communication impossible even indoors. The snow depth on level ground reached 27 inches by midnight, but the wind created drifts that were 12, 15, 20 feet tall. Cars were buried so completely that rescue crews would later walk over them without realizing they were there. At 8 p.m., Governor Dukakis declared a state of emergency and banned all motor vehicle traffic. But the order was meaningless. Nobody could move anyway. Somewhere between 2,000 and 3,500 vehicles were stranded on Route 128 alone. Tens of thousands more were trapped throughout the region. Emergency services were paralyzed. Ambulances couldn't respond to calls. Fire trucks couldn't reach fires. Police cruisers sat buried in their own parking lots. Boston, a city of 600,000, had essentially ceased to function. And the storm was just getting started. The storm stalled over New England like a spinning blade. Instead of moving out to sea, it sat stationary, drawing more moisture from the Atlantic, more cold air from Canada, dumping snow at an unrelenting pace. Boston recorded 27.1 inches of snow. Providence, Rhode Island, got 27.6 inches, but those numbers tell only part of the story. The wind redistributed the snow into formations that resembled geological structures more than weather. Drifts reached the second story of houses. Entire streets vanished under smooth white plains. At Massachusetts General Hospital, doctors and nurses who had reported for the morning shift realized they wouldn't be leaving. Patients who needed emergency care couldn't reach the hospital. The emergency room went eerily quiet while the wards filled with staff sleeping in chairs, on floors, wherever they could find space. Fenway Park, home of the Red Sox, became unrecognizable. The stadium filled with snow like a bowl, creating a crater of white nearly 30 feet deep in places. It would take weeks to excavate. The New England Aquarium seal tank was exposed to the elements. Staff stayed throughout the storm, ensuring the animals didn't freeze. They melted snow for drinking water when pipes froze and burned furniture to keep the temperature above lethal levels. In the suburbs, the situation was even more desperate. Entire neighborhoods lost power for days. People burned whatever they could find for heat. Some broke apart furniture. Others, more dangerously, used grills indoors and succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning. At least 6 people died this way in Massachusetts alone. A nursing home in Revere lost power and heat. The elderly residents, many unable to walk, were trapped on upper floors as the first floor flooded from storm surge. Staff and volunteers formed human chains to carry residents downstairs, through icy water, to waiting National Guard trucks. The coastal flooding was something nobody had anticipated. As the storm stalled offshore, it pushed a massive surge of seawater toward land. High tide on February 7th was catastrophic. In Revere and Quincy, waves crashed over seawalls and flooded entire neighborhoods. Combined with the snow and wind, it created an apocalyptic scene. Cars floated down streets. Houses were ripped from foundations. The ocean and sky became indistinguishable, a horizontal assault of water and ice. At least 50 boats sank in harbors along the coast. The Coast Guard station in Gloucester recorded waves over 30 feet high. For the crew attempting rescues, it was like operating in Arctic hurricane conditions. Roofs across the region began to collapse under the snow load. The Civic Center in Hartford, Connecticut, its roof designed for snow loads typical of the area, imploded at 4 a.m. on January 18th. Wait, wrong storm. But during the blizzard of '78, dozens of warehouses, stores, and barns suffered the same fate. The sound was distinct. First a crack, then a groan, then an explosive crash as steel beams buckled and roofs pancaked downward. One family in Framingham heard their garage roof collapsing and rushed outside just before their house roof followed. They watched from a neighbor's doorway as their home was crushed. They lost everything but survived. Food became scarce almost immediately. Grocery stores had been mobbed on the 6th, shelves stripped bare in hours. Now, with delivery trucks unable to move, there was no resupply. People shared what they had with neighbors. Some walked miles to reach open stores. Others simply went hungry. Hospitals faced critical shortages. Supplies couldn't be delivered. Staff couldn't rotate shifts. Doctors performed surgeries while exhausted, having worked 36-hour stretches without relief. At one Boston hospital, a doctor skied 6 miles from his home to reach work, carrying essential medications in a backpack. The National Guard was mobilized, but even they couldn't move effectively. Humvees and trucks got stuck. Snowmobiles became the only reliable transportation. Volunteers with snowmobiles became heroes, ferrying medical personnel, delivering food, rescuing stranded motorists. Peter Gossels, a local resident, used his snowmobile to transport a woman in labor to the hospital. He made dozens of such trips, saving lives through sheer determination. Stories like his multiplied across New England. The region's infrastructure had collapsed entirely. No mail delivery, no garbage collection. Schools closed, not for a day or two, but for over a week. Businesses shut down. The economic impact mounted into hundreds of millions of dollars. But the human toll was worse. People died in their cars from exposure. They died in their homes from fires started while trying to stay warm. They died of heart attacks while shoveling snow. At least 54 people in Massachusetts alone. Another 21 in Rhode Island. Across the Northeast, the death toll exceeded 100. And still the snow kept falling. The storm finally began moving out to sea on February 8th, but New England remained paralyzed. The snow had stopped, but nothing could move through what it left behind. Governor Dukakis extended the driving ban indefinitely. Only emergency vehicles were permitted on roads, and even they struggled. Snowplows worked around the clock, but clearing a single mile of highway took hours. The snow was too deep, too heavy, too densely packed. The National Guard deployed over 1,000 troops. They used military vehicles, some equipped with tank treads, to reach stranded motorists. On Route 128, the scene was like something from a disaster movie. Hundreds of cars sat buried, only antennas and roof edges visible. Guards walked on top of the snow, probing with poles to locate vehicles, then digging down to check for survivors. Most people had survived. They had run their engines intermittently, rationed their gas, shared body heat with strangers. But some hadn't been so lucky. Rescue crews found bodies in cars, people who had died from exposure or carbon monoxide poisoning in the first night. One remarkable survival story emerged from Route 128. A man had been trapped in his car for 3 full days. He had rationed a 6-pack of beer and a bag of chips, melted snow for water, and used floor mats and seat covers for insulation. When rescuers finally reached him, he was hypothermic but alive. Helicopters became essential. The Massachusetts State Police, Coast Guard, and private operators flew continuous missions, dropping supplies to stranded motorists, evacuating the injured, surveying the massive scope of the disaster. From the air, New England looked like it had been bombed. Roads were invisible. Buildings were half buried. Entire towns were cut off, accessible only by helicopter or snowmobile. The small town of Scituate on the coast south of Boston was particularly hard hit. Storm surge had destroyed dozens of homes. The town was without power, without heat, and completely isolated. National Guard helicopters dropped food, water, and blankets. Residents who stayed spent days in near-Arctic conditions. Grocery stores that managed to open faced crowds of desperate people. But with supply trucks still unable to move, there was little to sell. Bread, milk, and canned goods became precious commodities. Price gouging became a problem until authorities cracked down. Communication was sporadic. Phone lines were down across the region. People couldn't call to check on elderly relatives, on friends, on anyone. The uncertainty was agonizing. Radio became the lifeline. Stations broadcast continuously, reading lists of missing persons, announcing which shelters were open, coordinating volunteer efforts. DJs stayed on air for marathon shifts, becoming the voice of the community in crisis. One Boston radio host, David Brudnoy, broadcast for over 20 hours straight, taking calls from stranded people, connecting them with rescuers, providing information and reassurance. His voice became a symbol of resilience. Volunteers mobilized in extraordinary numbers. People with 4-wheel drive vehicles shuttled medical personnel to hospitals. Those with snowmobiles ran supply lines to cut off neighborhoods. Churches and community centers opened as shelters, feeding and housing hundreds. The sense of community was profound. Neighbors who had never spoken dug each other out. Strangers shared food, heat, and shelter. In the face of disaster, the social bonds that normally remained dormant came alive. But clearing the roads was a monumental task. Snowplows could push the snow only so far before running out of places to put it. Dump trucks had to carry it away, but there was so much that designated dumping areas filled up. The city of Boston eventually started dumping snow directly into the harbor. Route 128 didn't fully reopen until February 12th, 6 days after the storm hit. Even then, only one lane in each direction was passable. The final stranded cars weren't removed until mid-March, when the snow finally melted enough to reveal them. Logan Airport resumed limited operations on February 10th, but full service took weeks to restore. Mountains of snow lined the runways. Passengers whose flights had been canceled days earlier were still trying to get home. The economic impact was staggering. Massachusetts alone lost an estimated $500 million, equivalent to over $2 billion today. Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Connecticut suffered similar losses. Businesses closed permanently, unable to recover from a week of zero revenue. But people adapted. They learned to move through a landscape transformed beyond recognition. They learned to survive in conditions that seemed impossible. They learned that nature, even in a place as developed and modern as New England, could still bring everything to a halt. And slowly, painfully, the region began to recover. Spring came late in 1978. The massive snow piles didn't fully melt until May. For months, the landscape bore scars from the storm. Dead trees, their limbs snapped by ice and wind. Damaged buildings, repairs delayed by backlogged contractors, and a population that had learned a harsh lesson about complacency. The storm forced immediate changes to emergency management. Massachusetts completely overhauled its disaster response protocols. The state invested in new communication systems, expanded the National Guard's equipment inventory, and developed detailed plans for future winter emergencies. Weather forecasting underwent its most significant transformation. The National Weather Service recognized that the technology and methods of 1978 were inadequate. Investment poured into satellite technology, radar networks, and computer modeling. The NOAA Weather Radio Network expanded dramatically, ensuring that warnings could reach people even when other communication failed. By the mid-1980s, Doppler radar was being deployed across the country. Computer models became sophisticated enough to predict explosive cyclogenesis with reasonable accuracy. The forecast that might have saved thousands from being trapped on highways became possible. Today, a storm like the blizzard of '78 would be predicted days in advance. Governors would declare states of emergency before the first snowflake fell. Schools and businesses would close preemptively. Travel bans would be in place before roads became impassable. But the storm also changed infrastructure permanently. Route 128 was redesigned with emergency access points and turnaround areas. Plans were developed to convert highways into emergency supply routes. Building codes were updated to require higher snow loads on roofs. The cultural impact was perhaps even more profound. For anyone who lived through it, the blizzard of '78 became a defining memory. Not just a weather event, but a shared trauma that bound the region together. Even today, over 45 years later, mention the blizzard of '78 in New England and you'll see recognition in people's eyes. They'll tell you where they were when it hit. They'll describe being trapped, being cold, being terrified. They'll talk about neighbors who helped, strangers who shared shelter, the sense that everyone was in it together. The storm became the benchmark. Every subsequent winter storm is compared to it. When forecasters predict a major nor'easter, the inevitable question is asked, will it be another '78? So far, the answer has been no, not even close. The blizzard of 1993, the so-called storm of the century, was larger in geographic scope, but didn't have the same devastating impact on New England. The 2013 blizzard dropped more snow in some locations, but better forecasting and preparation prevented the catastrophic paralysis of '78. The combination of factors that made the blizzard of '78 so devastating was unique. The rapid intensification, the precise timing during commute hours, the coastal flooding, the complete failure of infrastructure, and most critically, the lack of warning that might have kept people safely home. Climate science now tells us that intense winter storms may become less frequent as the planet warms, but the ones that do occur may be more extreme. The pattern that created the '78 blizzard, two low-pressure systems merging over the coast, can still happen. If it does, we'll be better prepared than we were in 1978. But preparation only goes so far. Nature can still overwhelm human systems. Infrastructure can still fail. People can still find themselves trapped, cold, fighting for survival. The blizzard of '78 taught New England that modernity is a thin veneer. That civilization, with all its roads and power lines and heated buildings, can disappear in hours under the right conditions. That we're not as separate from nature as we pretend to be. It taught us humility. And it taught us that when everything fails, what remains is people helping people. Volunteers with snowmobiles, neighbors sharing heat, strangers pulling each other from buried cars. The infrastructure collapsed, but the human bonds held. That's the real legacy of the blizzard of '78. Not the snow totals or the economic damage or even the lives lost, though all of those matter. The legacy is the reminder that we're vulnerable, but we're also resilient. That disasters can strike without warning, but communities can survive them. New England remembers. The old-timers still tell the stories. Parents describe it to children who can barely imagine a world without smartphones and instant weather updates. The photographs remain, black and white images of a landscape transformed into something alien and hostile. And every winter, when the forecast calls for snow, there's a moment of calculation, a brief hesitation, a memory of February 6, 1978, when the sky fell and the region froze and nothing moved for days. It won't happen again, we tell ourselves. We tell ourselves we're prepared now, we know better. But somewhere in the North Atlantic, low-pressure systems are forming, moving, merging. The same atmospheric dynamics that created the blizzard of '78 are still at work. The ocean is still there, ready to flood the coast. The cold Arctic air is still descending. Nature hasn't changed, only our ability to see it coming has. And sometimes, late at night during a winter storm, when the wind howls and the snow flies horizontally past the window, the people who remember 1978 pause and listen. They remember what it was like when the warnings were wrong, when the roads became traps, when the region buried itself alive. They remember the blizzard of '78, and they hope it never happens again.